John and Sandra Parker had always been the kind of couple everyone admired. They seemed to have a rare and unshakable bond, one rooted in shared passions, mutual respect, and genuine love for each other. They met during their college years at a small liberal arts school, and their connection was immediate. From the moment they struck up a conversation during a campus event, they knew there was something special between them. Sandra was an art major with a deep love for photography. She spent her days capturing the world through her lens, always looking for beauty in the ordinary. John, on the other hand, had a deep love for history and literature. His dream was to become a professor and share his knowledge with others. Despite their differing academic interests, they were united in their love for exploration and discovery. Long walks through campus, hours spent in bookstores, and evenings discussing philosophy and art solidified their bond. Their relationship blossomed quickly, and within a few years they were inseparable. After graduation, they moved to the city together, eager to begin the next chapter of their lives. John was accepted into a prestigious Ph.D. program, while Sandra opened her own photography studio. Life was busy, but they made time for each other, always prioritizing their relationship. They traveled whenever they could, visiting art galleries in Europe, hiking through national parks, and spending quiet weekends in cozy cabins. Their life was a blend of adventure and stability, and they couldn't have been happier. 3 years into their marriage, John and Sandra began discussing the possibility of starting a family. It wasn't a decision they took lightly. They knew that raising children would be a significant change, and they wanted to make sure they were ready. They talked late into the night about what it would mean to be parents, imagining what their future children might be like. Sandra often daydreamed about taking their kids to art museums, showing them how to see the world through a creative lens. John envisioned reading them bedtime stories, teaching them about history, and sharing his love of literature. After months of careful consideration, they decided the time was right. They were excited about the idea of having children and eagerly anticipated what the future would bring. However, getting pregnant proved to be more challenging than they expected. Month after month passed and Sandra still wasn't pregnant. It was frustrating, but they tried to remain positive. They reassured each other that these things took time and that it would happen when the time was right. After nearly a year of trying, their persistence finally paid off. Sandra's pregnancy test came back positive, and the joy they felt was indescribable. They celebrated the news in the quiet, intimate way that had always defined their relationship. Over dinner that evening, they toasted to the future, their hands clasped together across the table. Tears of happiness filled Sandra's eyes as she imagined the little life growing inside her. John couldn't stop smiling. He was going to be a father. As the pregnancy progressed, Sandra's belly began to swell, and John marveled at the changes happening to his wife. He was in awe of her strength and grace, watching as she embraced the transformation with joy and patience. They spent their evenings planning the nursery, picking out baby clothes and discussing names. It felt like a dream. Everything was falling into place, and they couldn't wait to meet their child. At their 12-week ultrasound, they received news that changed everything. They weren't just expecting one baby, they were expecting 3. Triplets. The word echoed in the small examination room, and for a moment, neither of them knew how to react. The doctor smiled as he pointed out the 3 tiny figures on the screen, their little hearts beating steadily. John and Sandra exchanged glances, their eyes wide with disbelief. Triplets? How could this be? They had only planned for one baby. 3 seemed unimaginable. But as the shock wore off, a sense of excitement began to creep in. This was unexpected, yes, but it was also a miracle. They were going to be parents to 3 little lives, 3 little people who would fill their home with laughter and love. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. Suddenly, everything they had planned for one baby had to be multiplied by 3. The nursery had to be expanded, 3 cribs were ordered, and Sandra's family pitched in to help. John took extra shifts at his teaching assistant job to ensure they could afford all the necessary baby supplies. Despite the overwhelming nature of the situation, they approached it with optimism, leaning on each other for support. As Sandra's pregnancy progressed, the reality of carrying triplets began to take its toll. Her body was working overtime to nurture 3 growing babies, and by the 7th month, she was placed on strict bed rest. She hated being confined to the house, but John was there every step of the way, tending to her every need. He cooked, cleaned, and helped Sandra stay as comfortable as possible. Every evening, they would sit together and talk to her belly, feeling the baby's kick and move. It was a surreal experience knowing that their family was about to grow so dramatically in such a short time. The day the triplets were born was a blur of excitement and anxiety. After a long and difficult labor, Sandra gave birth to 3 healthy babies, 2 boys and a girl. The delivery room was filled with the cries of the newborns, and John felt his heart swell with pride and love. The nurses quickly wrapped the babies in blankets and handed them to their parents. John held his daughter first, gazing down at her tiny face with wonder. He couldn't believe that this little person was his, that he and Sandra had created her. Sandra, exhausted but glowing with joy, held their 2 sons. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at them. "We did it, John," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "They're here." John kissed her forehead, unable to find the words to express what he was feeling. His heart was so full, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. This was the family they had dreamed of, and now it was real. The early days of parenthood were a blur of sleepless nights, diaper changes, and feedings. Raising triplets was no easy task, and John and Sandra quickly found themselves overwhelmed by the constant demands of caring for 3 newborns. They operated in shifts. One would sleep while the other tended to the babies, and then they would switch. Their once quiet and orderly home was now filled with the sounds of crying infants and the clatter of baby bottles. Despite the exhaustion, they were happy. The triplets were beautiful, with their tiny fingers and delicate features. John marveled at how each baby had their own unique personality, even at such a young age. His daughter, Emma, was the quiet one, content to observe the world around her with wide, curious eyes. The oldest boy, Jake, was more vocal, often demanding attention with loud cries. The youngest, Luke, was the most energetic, always wiggling and squirming in his crib. As the months went by, John and Sandra settled into their new roles as parents. It wasn't easy, but they made it work. Their relationship, once defined by late-night talks and quiet dinners, had shifted to diaper changes and midnight feedings, but the love between them remained strong. They were partners in this new adventure, and that bond helped them navigate the challenges of raising triplets. However, as the triplets grew, John began to notice something that unsettled him. At first, it was just a fleeting thought, one that he quickly brushed aside. But over time, it became harder to ignore. The babies didn't resemble him at all. They were beautiful, yes, but their features didn't seem to match his. Their hair was a different color, their eyes were shaped differently, and their skin tone seemed lighter than his. He tried to push the thoughts away, telling himself that babies often change as they grow, but the doubt lingered. John found himself studying the babies more closely, looking for any sign that they were his. He would stand in front of the mirror, comparing his own features to theirs, searching for similarities. But no matter how hard he looked, he couldn't find any. It was an uncomfortable feeling, one that he didn't know how to deal with. He didn't say anything to Sandra at first. How could he? She was completely in love with the babies, and he didn't want to ruin that. She had gone through so much during the pregnancy and birth, and John didn't want to burden her with his doubts. But as time went on, the nagging feeling grew stronger, until it was impossible to ignore. One evening, as they sat together on the couch after the babies had gone to sleep, John finally voiced his concerns. He had been dreading this conversation for weeks, unsure of how Sandra would react. But he couldn't keep it to himself any longer. "Sandra," he began, his voice hesitant, "there's something I've been thinking about, something that's been bothering me for a while now." Sandra looked up from the book she was reading, her brow furrowing in concern. "What is it, John? You look upset." John took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "It's about the babies. I know this is going to sound crazy, but I've been noticing that they don't really look like me. I've been trying to ignore it, but I can't shake the feeling. Do you think, is it possible that something's wrong?" Sandra's face went pale, and she put down her book, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What do you mean? They don't look like you." "Of course they do. They're our children, John." I know, John said quickly, not wanting to upset her. "I'm not saying they aren't. But don't you think it's a little strange? They don't have any of my features. None at all." Sandra shook her head, her voice trembling. "John, I carried those babies for 9 months. I gave birth to them. They're ours." "I'm not doubting that," John replied, trying to stay calm. "But I can't help feeling like something's off. Maybe there was a mistake at the hospital or something. I don't know." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Sandra stared at him, her eyes filling with tears. "You're saying you don't think they're yours," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No," John said, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I'm saying I just want to be sure. I need to know." Sandra stood up abruptly, her face flushed with anger and hurt. "How can you say that, John? How can you even suggest that, after everything we've been through? You're questioning if these babies are yours." "I'm not trying to hurt you," Sandra, John said, standing up to face her. "But I can't keep this to myself anymore. It's been eating me alive. I just want some answers." The tears spilled over, and Sandra wiped them away angrily. "Fine," she said, her voice shaking. "If that's what you want, then let's get a DNA test. Maybe then you'll finally believe that these babies are yours." John opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He hadn't expected her to agree so quickly. The truth was, he wasn't sure what he wanted. He just knew he needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The next few days were tense and filled with a heavy silence between them. Sandra made the arrangements for the DNA test, and the process was quick and efficient. They swabbed the babies' mouths, and John provided his sample. Then, they waited. John couldn't focus on anything else during those days. His mind was consumed with worry and guilt. What if the babies weren't his? What would that mean for their family, for their marriage? He hated himself for even entertaining the thought, but now that the idea had taken root, it was impossible to ignore. Sandra, too, was distant, retreating into herself. She spent most of her time with the babies, holding them close as if trying to protect them from the storm that was brewing. John could see the hurt in her eyes every time she looked at him, and it tore him apart. He had always prided himself on being a supportive and loving husband, but now he felt like he was betraying her in the worst way possible. When the results finally came in, John's heart raced as he opened the envelope. The words seemed to blur on the page, but there was no mistaking their meaning. The babies were not his. John felt the world tilt beneath him as the reality of the situation sank in. The triplets, these beautiful, innocent children he had loved and cared for, were not biologically his. His mind raced with questions. How could this be? Had Sandra cheated on him? Was there some kind of mistake? He confronted Sandra that evening, the envelope clutched tightly in his hand. She was sitting on the floor of the nursery, playing with the babies, her face soft with love as she watched them giggle and coo-oh. But when she saw the look on John's face, her expression changed. "What is it?" she asked, standing up and brushing her hands on her jeans. John handed her the envelope without a word. She took it, her eyes scanning the contents. The color drained from her face, and she swayed slightly, as if she might faint. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This can't be right. There's been a mistake." "Sandra," John said, his voice tight with emotion. "What's going on? Did you?" "No," Sandra cried, her eyes wide with horror. "John, I would never do that to you, I swear. I don't know how this happened." John stared at her, his heart pounding. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that this was all some kind of terrible mistake. But the evidence was there, staring him in the face. Over the next few days, they sought answers. They met with doctors, genetic specialists, and hospital administrators, desperate to understand what had gone wrong. After a series of consultations and further DNA tests, the unthinkable truth was revealed. There had been a mix-up at the hospital. On the day Sandra gave birth, another couple had also delivered triplets. In the chaos of the maternity ward, the babies had been accidentally switched. The news hit John and Sandra like a sledgehammer. The triplets they had raised for over a year were not theirs. Somewhere out there, another couple was raising their biological children. The hospital launched an investigation, and after weeks of legal proceedings and further testing, the other family was identified: the Andersons. Mark and Laura Anderson were a middle-aged couple who had, like the Parkers, been overjoyed at the birth of their triplets. They had no idea that the children they were raising weren't biologically theirs. The two families agreed to meet, though the tension and fear in both households was palpable. When the Parkers and Andersons finally sat down together, it was a surreal and heartbreaking experience. The Andersons' triplets bore a striking resemblance to John and Sandra, while the Parkers' biological children mirrored the Andersons' features. Both families were devastated. How could this have happened? How were they supposed to move forward? The emotional weight of the situation was unbearable. They had spent over a year bonding with these children, raising them as their own, and now they were being asked to confront the reality that their true children were with someone else. For days, John and Sandra barely spoke. They were consumed by grief and confusion, unsure of what to do. Should they switch the children back? Should they continue raising the babies they had come to love, even though they weren't biologically theirs? There were no easy answers. Eventually, after many long and tearful discussions, both families came to a decision. They agreed that the well-being of the children had to come first. Rather than uproot the triplets from the only home they had ever known, they would slowly integrate the children into each other's lives. The two families would become one, with both sets of parents playing a role in the children's upbringing. It was a complex and emotionally challenging arrangement, but it was the best solution they could come up with. Over time, the Parkers and the Andersons developed a close-knit, unconventional family dynamic. The children grew up knowing that they had two sets of parents, one biological and one by circumstance, and while it was confusing at times, the love they received from both families was undeniable. For John and Sandra, the journey was one of heartbreak, healing, and acceptance. They had learned that family wasn't just about biology, it was about love, sacrifice, and the willingness to put others before yourself. Despite the pain and confusion of the past, they had found a way to move forward, united by the love they had for their children, biological and otherwise. In the end, the triplets grew up surrounded by love, with two sets of parents who cared for them deeply, and though the circumstances that brought them together were extraordinary, they were a family in every sense of the word.